Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Monticello live stream. Today, we are talking with Thomas Jefferson, as interpreted by Bill Barker, on the War of 1812. Leave your questions in the comments and let us know where you're watching from.
Well, what a pleasure indeed to visit with you here this afternoon, and an interesting subject, I dare say, that of what has become known as the War of 1812. I'm hoping the last war that we ever engaged with Great Britain. So I will provide for you some reflections, but I can tell you with great thanks, I was not in the office as Chief Magistrate of our nation at that time. Though I rarely use the word retire, I had already given the gavel to Mr. Madison the 4th of March, 1809, and left the office of the presidency after 2 terms, 8 years. As I have said, 8 years of a splendid misery. I lost many friends. So I was more than happy to come home here to Monticello, and yet to continue to be in correspondence with Mr. Madison. So I certainly remember much of what ultimately led him to follow Congress's approval, the vote of Congress, to declare war upon Great Britain that June of 1812. So here already I am speaking overly long, ignoring the many questions that you may have. So thank you for being with us, and I look forward to your question. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Mr. Jefferson. So our first question today is asking about your time as the president. When you were president from 1801 to 1809, did you have any concerns that there might be another war between the United States and England?
Yes, I certainly did. And so did our nation. Perhaps there were 3 concerns that I had predominant during my second administration. The first, of course, was that succeeding in my first administration to acquire over 830,000 square miles west of the Mississippi River, we looked forward to a peaceable settlement in that direction, as I have said, to the 100th and 1,000th generation of farmers yet to come. And yet, to the northwest, there continued to be great concerns relevant to freely settling with the natives of this continent. The concerns were because there still existed British forts there in the Northwest, and the British were still trying to antagonize the natives of that land not to accept our free settlement to the West. Now, secondly, there was a great concern with the impressing of our nation's sailors. Yes, that is, the sailors in our merchant vessels who would set out freely from American ports to conduct business with the various ports across the globe, predominant, of course, in the Atlantic Ocean and the kingdoms of Europe. Literally, the British would approach our merchant vessels. They would politely ask to board, and when our merchant vessels would reply nay, well, then the British would open fire upon our merchant vessels. The most famous of these occasions happened just off the coast of Virginia, not too far from Norfolk, when our vessel, the Chesapeake, was taking leave full of stores, and was approached by a British vessel, the Leopard. And the Leopard politely asked to board the Chesapeake. And of course, our sailors knew the reason why, not only to make off with the stores on our Chesapeake, but also to impress our sailors. And so thereby, there was a great attack by the Leopard upon the Chesapeake. And it caused a great stir throughout our nation. In fact, I wrote as much of a stir as that of Lexington. Back in 75, I was almost assured that our nation would move towards engaging war with Britain, but we did not. And then I might say that thirdly, the Federalist political faction had engaged peaceable, I will not deny, trade and commerce with England. This in the midst of the war between England and France. Oh, I would like to say General Bonaparte, no, he had crowned himself emperor, Emperor Napoleon, engaging this war throughout all of the kingdoms of Europe, but particularly with Great Britain. And therefore, though New England wanted to continue to trade peaceably with England, our southern states were looking to trade peaceably with France. We could not avoid a conflict there, and so it was necessary that I, just before I left in office, began an embargo. That is, that our nation would not trade with any kingdom of Europe. But that, I lament to say, was a failure. All of these concerns will want to exacerbate a war which eventually broke out between our nation and Great Britain.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. The next question would naturally perhaps be, did President Madison declare war on Great Britain?
Well, President Madison acted at the behest of Congress. Now, I know this question is perhaps referring to me with the fact that in 1801, the late spring of 1801, as president, though I went to Congress, asked that Congress might proclaim war with the Kingdom of Tripoli because of, well, the extraction of monies from our merchant vessels, the attacking of our merchant vessels by the Barbary pirates, all of this, the neglecting and denying of the treaties, many of which that I had negotiated with the Barbary kingdoms, not only Tripoli, but Tunis, Algiers, and Morocco, all of these treaties being broken. Well, though I went to Congress and asked them to encourage war against Tripoli, no, Congress merely gave me the approval that I might proclaim that war. So very different, and to the point in our Constitution, which states clearly that war can only be proclaimed on behalf of our nation by Congress. Yes, President Madison did go to Congress. Congress then agreed, and officially it was the 18th of June, 1812, that our Congress declared war upon Great Britain.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, what were your thoughts then about the United States entering into another war with Great Britain?
Well, I thought that as our main concern were the northwest borders, I mentioned that earlier, that we might secure our defenses, particularly through the Great Lakes, particularly along the St. Lawrence River, recognizing that at the time our nation was approaching a population of 9 million, that in the Canadas, the provinces, if you will, north of the St. Lawrence, that there were about 500,000 of the English, that we could easily be victorious in a war in that particular theater. I said, in a march through the Canadas, that we could overtake all of the forts, and they have proved successful at the very beginning. Would that it could have occurred. Lamentably, it did not. And we actually lost a great deal of the conflicts that greeted us there in trying to secure that northern border of the St. Lawrence River.
Well, so thinking about this war, Mr. Jefferson, did you or any of your family members serve in this War of 1812, as it's called?
Bill, I certainly did not. I was much too old to be enlisted in any service of our nation in the military, although I may tell you I still maintain my commission as Lieutenant Colonel of Virginia Militia, though not a colonel of our nation's armies. However, my son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mann Randolph, the husband of my eldest daughter, Martha Jefferson, he did seek at the commencing of our war with Great Britain in 1812 a commission by President Madison, and thereby did receive the commission as colonel of our armies. So my son-in-law, Colonel Thomas Mann Randolph, was asked to raise up the 20th Virginia Regiment. And so thereby, yes, my own son-in-law did enlist quite a number of our fellow Virginians within this Tidewater region, in and about Richmond, even from Maryland, to engage then a march up to what I had just referred to earlier, the theater of war in the Great Lakes and along the St. Lawrence. They set out, let me see, it was the the late summer of 1813 to march up to Sackett's Harbor. That is where the general of our armies, James Wilkinson, had convened a number of our forces. So Colonel Randolph, my son-in-law, set up in a march there, several hundred men, not many, by way of Carlisle in Pennsylvania, and then farther northwards to reach Sackett's Harbor there in that September in October of 1813. Now, what is very interesting about this particular march northwards, with that idea, as I mentioned earlier, march through the Canadas, is that when Colonel Randolph finally arrived in Sackett's Harbor, then he became instrumental in the forces that were led by General Wilkinson, first to encamp upon Grenadier Island. Now, Grenadier Island, you might think, is perhaps, though smaller than Wolfe Island, there at the head of the St. Lawrence River, is one of, let alone Wolfe and many others, of the mille îles, as the French would refer to them, the thousands of islands, right there where all of the Great Lakes empty into the St. Lawrence River, where there are over, I would say, 1,500 islands carved out of the natural granite, I have heard, to begin the journey of the St. Lawrence all the way down 600 miles to the Bay of the St. Lawrence there and the Atlantic Ocean. After their encampment upon Grenadier Island, they set out, but within a short distance, the British had already sailed out from Kingston, of course, on the Canadian side of that thousands of islands, and they were all docked there at Carleton Island. Fort Holdeman was the name of their fortress upon Carleton Island, just not far down from Grenadier Island to the east. And so it was that my grandson had informed me, my son-in-law, beg pardon, had informed me that his forces, along with General Wilkinson, sailed farther east down the St. Lawrence to a vantage point known as French Creek. Now, I will tell you, I have heard word that as my son-in-law was accompanied by Brigadier General Jacob Brown, that my son-in-law found more solace and more camaraderie in the company of Jacob Brown than he did in the company of General Wilkinson. In fact, to the point that it is said, and I'm somewhat hesitant, though I will tell you this was information that we needed to understand at the time, that General Wilkinson was observed to be very much in his cups. Now, grant you, this was during the late autumn, the fall, November 1813, so it was very, very cold. There was already, I'm told, snow on the ground. But our forces had the advantage to make an encampment there at the mouth of French Creek. This was near a very small settlement known as Teresa. Teresa, of course, named for one of the daughters of Jacques de Nash and Leray de Chameau, Leray de Chameau being one of the early supporters of our American Revolution. Now, it was because of their early arrival at French Creek and the particular camp that when the enemy, realizing they had been passed by our American forces there, sailing just south of Carleton Island, were attracted to do battle with our forces at French Creek, that our forces were so well entrenched that indeed very much at the beginning there, our forces over 2-3 days repelled the British at the Battle of French Creek that November 1813, and would that could have remained our activity and that success. I'm afraid it did not. As our forces continued to sail down the St. Lawrence, though my son-in-law, Colonel Randolph, realized a particular victory at Fort Matilda, which was nothing more, it was hardly a fort. It was just a warehouse of munitions. It was later at Chrysler's Farm, and I hardly want to repeat what occurred there, but we had a dramatic loss at Chrysler's Farm. Now, you may wonder why I give this long exposition about that activity. It is because it was an eyewitness account relayed to me by my son-in-law, who bore witness to all these maneuvers, who particularly bore witness to the character of General Wilkinson. Oh, I had known Wilkinson for long. My son-in-law knew how he was very much involved with my former Vice President, Aaron Burr. You know what I'm referring to. That's conspiracy, very much so, to attack New Orleans. And it was General Wilkinson who was able to inform me of these maneuvers when he realized that his association with Colonel Burr would not succeed. So I can only tell you that when I learned later, after the war, that Brigadier General Jacob Brown would succeed General Wilkinson as the head of our armies, I could not have been more relieved. John Quincy Adams even made a remark that with Brown taking over our armies, it reinstituted the integrity of our officers and our armies with that point.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, that is absolutely fascinating. And we actually have a question from a listener today named Chester, and they are wondering, and perhaps your son-in-law may have told you about this, how did weapons or battlefield strategies change from the American Revolution to this War of 1812? Were there any changes in how war was conducted?
I would say that the change was perhaps evidenced upon our victories on the high seas. Because we forget that the War of 1812 witnessed a great many, ocean victories on our behalf. I'm speaking, of course, of the USS Constitution and her victory against the HMS Guerriere. That victory, of course, just off of Halifax and Nova Scotia, was brilliant in its tactics. And brilliant because, you're asking, well, though the Constitution was constructed after the American Revolution, it was constructed with hull 22 inches thick. And so, again, by eyewitness account, we heard that the Guerriere continued in her open fire against the Constitution to pound the sides of the Constitution, the whole of the Constitution, relentlessly. But it was as if all began to realize, oh my heavens, the whole of the Constitution is not built out of wood, it's built out of iron. Ironsides has survived. And so I dare say old Ironsides is very much an example of the strategy of improving our Navy at that time. You know what is curious about this? When you think that at the commencing of the War of 1812, the British were wont to exclaim over 500 warships, that we had only upwards of about 16, and we lost several. We lost the Essex, we lost the Chesapeake, we lost the President. That still we were able to survive because of that remarkable construction of our warships. So I would say that that was a great advance in our victory upon the high seas.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Jefferson. We've talked about how the war, obviously there were some advances that came out of it, but were there any negative impacts of the War of 1812 on your finances particularly?
Oh, my heavens, negative impact? Of course there was. The negative impact I already referred to began with the conflict between France and England, began with none other, of course, than the Emperor Napoleon. My heavens, he became, as one remarked, the scourge of Europe in his aggressions throughout all of the European kingdoms. This, of course, put our nation at a great stalemate is to trade with either England or France. And I mentioned earlier the necessity of the embargo and the fact that that embargo failed because it was detrimental to our New England states. And I could not forget that as I was president of the nation, I was president of New England, as I was president of our middle states and the southern states as well. So before I left office, that embargo was repealed, but not before a great detriment to the trade in our nation. And though in the repeal, Senator Macon of North Carolina was able to institute the Non-Intercourse Act, meaning that we could trade with other kingdoms of Europe, but not with England and France until one or the other would desist in its conflict, we still suffered. So much so that most of our produce here was engaged in order to support our troops during the war. And so there, that required for our labor to continue to work well beyond sundown. Also, in the manufacture of clothing and whatnot, we could not afford any longer to purchase fine English cloth. That was always amongst the finest of our imports to this nation. So without being able to purchase cloth from England, we had to resort to homespun, literally, the weaving of cloth right here on our own farms, nonetheless, at Monticello. The weaving, if you will, of wool from our own sheep, the weaving, if you will, of linen here from our own farm. Why, Harriet Hemings was employed in this effort amongst many of the labor here at Monticello, more than others.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. And speaking about mentioning some names of the enslaved at Monticello, could you speak on how this war impacted the lives of enslaved people at Monticello?
Well, I can tell you that the enslaved here at Monticello were quite aware of what was occurring far to the east. I have mentioned already that most of our labor here became preoccupied in providing enough produce in the cultivation of our crops to support our troops during that war. But to the east in Virginia, to the east in Maryland, there in the great Chesapeake Bay, do you know that the British Navy, what was his name, British Vice Admiral Cochrane, sailed his boats into the Chesapeake and thereby offered an opportunity for the enslaved of various Maryland and Virginia farms to leave their plantations and to enlist in the service of the British, to enlist thereby. Do you know, I believe it was upwards, if I can recollect, it was upwards of about, I want to say 4,000, perhaps more, that I heard that became loyalists unto the enemy in waging war against us at that time. Do you know this was a strategy that was employed even before our American Revolution began? Lord Dunmore's proclamation, John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, in the autumn of 1775, he proclaimed that all enslaved deserting from their masters could indeed seek a solace and employment in the service of the British at that time. And that as well did see many enslaved turn to the service of the British there at the commencing of our American Revolution.
So, Mr. Jefferson, thinking about the War of 1812, can you tell us how exactly did the war end, and who do you feel was the true victor?
The war ended with the Treaty of Ghent. There provided, of course, in Belgium with a reconciliation, negotiations for reconciliation between the British and our nation, very much overseen, of course, by Quincy Adams, John Quincy Adams, and I think overseen pretty much as a stalemate, that neither side was certainly victorious more than the other. Now, this was in December 1814. Now, imagine this was after one of the enemy's last attempt in sailing up the Potomac River to lay siege to our nation's capital, Washington City, that August of 1814. I was not there, but I heard directly from President Madison later that he and his lady, of course, in the president's house, having heard that the enemy was entering a federal city, did the best that they could possibly do to remove many of the fine portraits, particularly that marvelous Lansdowne portrait of the late General Washington and his lady from the walls of the president's house, that they might be brought to safekeeping. And then, of course, President Madison enlisted in the service of our nation and served at the Battle of Bladensburg but a short time later. And remember what the British did. They not only, in attacking our federal city, burned the president's house, they also burned our Capitol building and thereby destroyed our Library of Congress. Now, not that there were that many books in our Library of Congress at that time, but I certainly lamented the burning of that library. The burning of any books is something I find abhorrent and totally opposed to the enlightenment of the mind of man. And that is one of the reasons why that a year later, in 1815, I made every effort to offer my library here at Monticello to offer it for sale. About 6,400 books I offered for sale. I think upwards of about $17,000 that our nation might pay me. I consider it a pittance when you think of the greater enlightenment of our nation with those books to refresh a Library of Congress. Now, referring to refreshment, how can we ever forget that in the midst of this great conflagration in our federal city, two things occurred. The one is that British General Blackburn actually refused the burning of our patent department. I had presided over the patent department in my commission as Secretary of State. I had procured the first 5 patents in our nation. So can you imagine, so many years later, 18 and 14, they realized the integrity, the wisdom, the enlightenment of the American mind could not be destroyed, that they might have the opportunity to benefit from that. So they saved the patent department. Now, what I was driving at, referring to refreshment, is the fact that in the midst of the burning of our federal city, it was all interrupted by, have you heard? A thunderstorm. An immense thunderstorm doused the British fires in our federal city. Now, if you want to refer to that as divine providence, I stand by your side.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. That's incredibly interesting. But there is a figure we have not yet touched on, and that is General Andrew Jackson. And we are curious if you have ever encountered him in your life.
Yes, I certainly have. Yes, I have encountered General Jackson. I just referred to the fact, you may have heard, that the Treaty of Ghent, to bring to a formal conclusion what has been known as the War of 1812, was there negotiated and signed in December of 1814. Well, you would think that would be the end of it. No, it was not the end of it. The British, of course, were still in tow, and they had sailed into the delta of the great Mississippi River. They had sailed up to New Orleans to lay siege there, continue on up the Mississippi to disrupt us on our western borders. And there, of course, was witnessed a great victory. Our victory against the British at the Battle of New Orleans, led, of course, by our General Andrew Jackson. Now, I had already heard of Jackson, yes. He had written to me on several occasions. And so I knew of him as an individual of, let me put it this way, great ambition. And I can assure you that he would make a great victory march that January 18 and 15 from his success, the victory of New Orleans, all the way up northeast, finally to Washington City, and there to be received with great acclaim and the feting, if you will, of that victory, and the Washington Society to turn out to him en masse. Well, I was in seclusion at my retreat house, Poplar Forest, there in Bedford County. And I remember distinctly, I was writing a letter to my daughter, Mrs. Randall, when suddenly there was a tap on the door, great commotion out of doors of the Poplar Forest house. And I wrote in the letter, beg your pardon, there appears to be someone at the door. So I went to the door, and there, walking out onto the porch, was General Jackson, astride his white steed, his hat all festooned with plumage, and that of all of his equerries and generals and officers mounted on their horses beside him, and then a retinue, if you will, of troops just behind them. Now, here in the wilderness, at Poplar Forest, where I go to retreat, where I go to get away. And the point of the matter being that I knew very well, having received the invitation, that evening there would be a feting of the general and his officers in Lynchburg, the town named for Judge Lynch there, along the upper James River. So I merely said, well, General, a pleasure to be introduced to you here, but I will be seeing you later on. He was attempting to dismount to come up on the porch to me, and I more or less halted that effort and said, so, if you will, I look forward later on that we have more time to acquaint one with the other. And I walked back in the house and I shut the door, and I simply continued my letter. It was merely General Jackson. I told him that we would meet later at the fete in Lynchburg.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, that is a intriguing story. Thank you for sharing that. I suppose a rather more all-encompassing question would be, do you feel that the War of 1812 will have a lasting impact on the relationship between the United States and England?
I remember thinking at the time, after reading, of course, all of the negotiations and the success of that treaty again, that it appears that our north boundaries there along the St. Lawrence are now finally secured. That it does appear that perhaps we can continue to settle to the west, although and settle to the west freely, though with one caveat. And that caveat, of course, is how we might continue to settle easily with the natives of the land. I had made it a concern when I commissioned Captain Meriwether Lewis, and he welcomed Lieutenant William Clark to provide their military reconnaissance commencing back in 1803. I had made it a concern that as they are introduced to many, a tribe never known by the white man east of the Appalachian Mountains, that they make every effort to make friends with them. And that is why a great amount of the monies offered by Congress, that was in January 1803, $2,500, that at least $700 would be provided for Indian gifts to the natives, to show them that we desired to be their friends, that we desired to conduct peaceable commerce with them. But I am sorry to say that as a result of the War of 1812, that is now questionable. That as we continue to settle west, will this involve the removing of the natives from this land? Is that the policy that we should follow as we continue to settle to the west? Will we be able to ingratiate ourselves with them and ameliorate the settlements one with the other? Can that be? And this concerns me. It concerns me as well in that regard. What made General Jackson himself consider, now that he has tasted the sweetness of liberty to such an extent, what might he consider remaining in his, quite prominent military position, as we all realized back in 1814 and 1815? Will he then be amenable to these farther settlements to the west in making friends with the natives? Well, as you know, I'm now questioning that to a great degree. I'm very concerned about Senator Jackson. I'm concerned that he may be seeking political aggrandizing upon the platform, my own platform, that has become known as Democratic Republicans, Anti-Federalists, Jeffersonian Republicans. Will it be that purity of platform that I have known, or will it turn into something a bit more popular, if you will, popular out on the frontier with a negative attitude towards the natives of this land? He could very well prove himself ill-equipped if he is to suggest standing for the highest office. So that is my concern as to how the end of that war in 1812, those 3 years, has left the future of our settlements to the far west.
So, Mr. Jefferson, we have an audience question from Kelly, and they're curious, how do you think you prepared President Madison for the War of 1812 with his being your Secretary of State? Do you feel you prepared him?
I think that President Madison, in his commission as Secretary of State in my 2 administrations, could not have been the more prepared in any other commission or in any other office than he was during those 8 years, to understand what he would then inherit when he took the oath of office the 4th of March, 1809, to understand how our concerns with England may continue to the detriment. Now, I will tell you who else was understanding of this, and that is our Secretary of the Treasury, my good friend, Monsieur Albert Gallatin. He was certainly understanding as well. And he had a concern about the manipulations that were being engaged by the Emperor Napoleon, how far the Emperor Napoleon might proceed in his scourge throughout European kingdoms. So we were prepared to keep an eye on this, let alone to keep an eye on the British. As I mentioned earlier, the impressing of American seamen into the service of the British had long been a concern. And when you realize, and I know President Madison certainly understood this better than I did, we witnessed over 400 ships that were attacked. And as a result of that, imagine this, before the war actually commenced in June of 1812, 400 ships attacked and over 6,000 of our sailors impressed into the British naval service. So I can only suggest that it would be disrespectful to think that former Secretary of State Madison did not have a good idea of keeping an eye still both on the Emperor Napoleon, let alone upon the British, after he took that oath of office. And I do consider well prepared when he went to Congress and legally and by proper parliamentary procedure and rule of the law, Congress then proclaimed that war.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, we've had a very interesting discussion today, but I think to wrap up today's discussion, we have one final question, and that is to ask you, what legacies of the War of 1812 remain in mind with you as either a caution or a benefit for the future of the United States?
I can tell you one legacy. I don't know whether many want to remember this. But when I mentioned rather quickly that perhaps the result of the War of 1812 was a stalemate, that no one really gained in that war, that it was a great expenditure of money, that we saw, if you will, rechartered our national bank. That should be up for rechartering again in 1832. Whoever will be president at that time will, of course, have to negotiate with our nation and with the bank of our nation accordingly. But I think that that we failed to realize that we did have a gain, a slight gain, a gain in real estate. I'm not speaking about the territory of Louisiana. That was acquired before the war began. I'm not speaking about, if you will, the control of the Mississippi River, New Orleans. No, we had already gained that. I'm going to go back to the St. Lawrence River. Absolutely. And remember initially that I made mention that my son-in-law, Colonel Randolph, as he finally achieved the aim of his march to Saggett's Harbor, then followed with about, I think there were about 250 men in his regiment at that time, then were encamped upon Grenadier Island. Does anyone remember the name of the island immediately following that to the east? As small as Grenadier Island, not as large as Wolf Island, right there in the Middle Ears. Yes, you're absolutely right. Carleton Island. Remember I mentioned that it witnessed the British Fort Haldimand? Well, it was a British island. Do you know our gain in the War of 1812? We gained some real estate. That's all. We gained Carleton Island as now part of our nation's holdings. The boundary was then drawn just above Carleton Island in those thousands of islands. I will tell you this, that as my son-in-law, Mr. Colonel Thomas Van Randolph, and his lady, my daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, have had 11 children. Their eldest child, my granddaughter, Anne Carey Randolph, who married Mr. Bankhead, Charles Bankhead, were given, if you will, about 500 acres just to the northwest of Monticello there. Part of that Lewis Holdings, upwards of about 1,000 acres. At the north end of that 1,000 acres, the farmhouse. But at the south end of that 1,000 acres, the Bankhead farmhouse, just below Monticello there. They have named their farm. They have named their farmhouse Carleton. Now, I will say no more about that. Let you all be the judge, perhaps further research if you so choose. But that is something to reflect upon. After those 3 years, after the great loss of life, that we did have an advantage. Is that the legacy? Let the legacy really be the more so that we are ever prepared in our defenses, prepared for any instance that could provoke us into a war, and prepared for any concerns that might ultimately lead us there. Being prepared is the first and foremost legacy that any war should allow for what may come next. I thank you, citizens. I thank you for this opportunity that we could reflect, that you've allowed me an opportunity to reflect on that late war. I'm certainly not in favor of it, but in the defense of our nation, in the defense of our borders, sometimes this is of necessity. I welcome you in our next gathering, and rest you assured I ever remain your humble and obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson. Godspeed.